When you look at Ellora in the context of Indian cave temple architecture, it has a great significance for the reason that it's kind of a culmination and a zenith of cave architecture in India. Because as we know that cave architecture in India starts from say Lomas Rishi cave from Bihar, then you have most of the activity happening in Western India, starting from Bhaja, then Kondavite, all the sites, even Karla. So you have a continuous activity of cave architecture from say 100 BC to almost 3rd century AD, especially the Hinayana phase. Though of course the terminology can be different about Hinayana, but usually we say that Hinayana phase. So, but then of course the cave architecture goes from there. I mean, it kind of culminates again in the case of, it reaches the zenith in the case of Ajanta. Then from Ajanta it disperses and again it comes back into Ellora. And when you look at Ellora Kailashnath, this is a very interesting aspect of Ellora Kailashnath is that it takes a lot of tradition, which we almost use it as a kind of encyclopedia of Indian temple architecture development, because when you want to look at the roots of this architecture tradition goes to say Hinayana to one way, then you have architecture tradition of Badami, then Mahabalipuram. All those architecture traditions are kind of culminates back in Ellora Kailashnath, specifically Kailashnath. And so I would actually prefer to call it as a national style of architecture, or in the sense it is a kind of all artisans from all over India kind of comes to Ellora and works especially for Kailashnath of Ellora. But when you look at the development of cave architecture in Ellora itself, Ellora can also be used as a kind of reference to the architecture tradition starting from say 5th century. We are not very sure about the date, but 5th century onwards you have an architecture tradition, cave architecture tradition, to be specific, from 5th to 12th century. So, when you go to say cave number 28, and 28, which is the earliest caves in Ellora, we kind of identify as earliest caves in Ellora. That maybe it is contemporaneous to Ajanta or even predating Ajanta. So when you look at the tradition of those cave carving techniques, or the way the space is kind of conceived in those caves, especially cave number 28 and 27, you can see that it's very close to say activity happening in Malwa, that is Udayagiri caves and things like that. So it is definitely usually we have a tradition. We have a kind of tendency to see the cave architecture in a very religious point of view. Like for example, the Buddhist comes, then the Brahminical activity comes, then the Jain activity, which is actually a wrong way of looking at it, for the reason that in certain areas, Brahminical activity comes first, then, sometimes it is contemporaneous to the Buddhist activity. So, my point here is that Ellora becomes a kind of, nice reference book for the art lovers, or in the sense, the students of architecture and art, where you want to kind of read from say 5th century to 12th century, what is happening, in sculpture, what is happening, in architecture, what is happening, and what are the innovations in architecture which are actually happening in those areas. Like for example, you can say that, okay, there are references when you look at certain sculptures or architecture, to specific, you may get some kind of link to say Chalukyan, some link to Pallavas. And especially in the case of Chalukyan, I have to say that, Ellora actually influences Chalukyans, in the sense the influence from Ellora to say Chalukyan sites like Badami. And then of course it kind of matures and comes back. So Ellora act like what we can say a fountainhead also. Usually we consider some areas fountainhead of something. And then kind of another side as a kind of culmination of it. Like for example, if you look at say Badami caves, I mean Badami Chalukyan activity, it starts. I mean that is the kind of fountainhead of Chalukyan activity in Badami. But then it culminates in somewhere else. Like for example, Pattakal, it culminates in Pattakal, but it doesn't come back to Badami. But in case of Ellora, that's why Ellora is a very interesting subject. Because it starts as a fountainhead also, then it kind of amalgamates. And another very interesting aspect of Ellora is that when you look at say cave temple architecture, it completely turns it around. In the sense, Ajanta has a kind of unity of activity and all those things, but Ellora has this kind of continuous activity for almost what we can say 5th to say 12th, that almost 700 years. And nowhere in India you can see this continuous activity for 700 years. Of course, not under one dynasty, definitely not under one dynasty. That's also another very interesting aspect, that why all the dynasties or all the ruling powers kind of built in Ellora. That means that area or the site has some kind of importance. I mean, now of course we just have one village and things like that. But I can also say that Ellora activity doesn't stop by Rashtrakutas. I mean you have Maratha activity in Ellora. I mean if you include painting and the things like that, Maratha activity in Ellora. Or even building, architecture also, you have Maratha architecture in Ellora. I mean Ahilyabai Holkar has built something there. Then you have Islamic architecture also in Ellora. So it is, we always from the university, we take the students to Ellora, so it gives them a kind of complete picture of what is happening, in that 700 years. Now, when you look at the development of cave architecture in Ellora and in reference to the other sites, of course, 5th century it kind of starts. I mean, 5th century is a very crucial period for the reason that there are activities in the revival of say cave temple architecture or cave architecture happening in Western India. Because Western India, I mean, if you look at say sites like Junnar or sites like Karle or Bhaja, for example. I mean, especially I'm saying Junnar for one reason, that Junnar has more than 150 caves. So there are activities like, whenever we have an architectural activity, I always try to see it in relation with economics, because sculpture is easier to do. Especially I'm not talking about the cave sculptures, I'm talking about the individual sculptures. If somebody wants to make a sculpture, they can do. But architecture is not like that. Somebody has to sponsor it, in the sense it is a huge activity. In the sense it takes a lot of money. And people are not going to invest in areas which does not have an importance. Whether it has to have a political significance, that site should have a political importance, or economical importance, that if it should be on a trade route or some kind of people are coming there. They are not coming for the architecture. So the architecture is built to kind of enhance that visit. I mean, in the sense, say Ajanta. So we say Ajanta. Ajanta had a kind of market next to it, or it has to have a market next to it. And when you look at the geography, because when you look at architecture also, that we have to look at the geography, topography of that particular site and why the site is chosen. In the case of Ellora also, we have to say that it is an important site for the reason that when you talk about in introduction to Ellora, I would always say that it is very close to Aurangabad, it is very close to Daulatabad, and Daulatabad was a crucial center, because that's why people are attacking it, or people are making forts there and all those things. So it is part of the trade kind of route. And of course we have later Islamic activity in Khultabad, which is also very interesting, that it becomes a kind of sacred center. So you have Aurangabad, Khultabad, Daulatabad, and of course when you go slightly away from Ellora, like around 40 kilometers, you have Pitalkhora. So it is basically that site was important for the reason that probably for the trade reason. So that's why you are making it there. You have to kind of, every dynasty want to kind of show off that, okay, we are building this temple for blah 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 blah. So those rulers actually chosen Ellora for a particular reason. And I mean, when you look at the beginning of Ellora as what we can say a tirtha or a sacred pond or a sacred center, we have this pond which is, I mean, this is a waterfall and kind of a pool created out of the waterfall, which is known as Sita Ki Nani. Sita Ki Nani. That means the place where Sita took bath. I mean, of course, we have in India, we have 121 places where Sita took bath and Rama did something and Bhima did something and all those things. So it kind of makes it a kind of ritualistic site. Why I am saying this is that we have a inscription or a copper plate inscription in dated 742, which is Danda Durga's inscription. Danda Durga, who actually, before building something in Ellora, you have an activity of Danda Durga at Ellora. So the inscription says that taking bath in the sacred pond of Sita, of course it doesn't exactly mention Sita Ki Nani, that is a later name, but sacred pond at Ellora or Velur, he gives a land grant to a Brahmin from Navsari or somewhere like that. Now the important point is that here is not a king but an what we can say an aspiring emperor or aspiring king giving land grant to a Brahmin there, taking baths from the river. So that means the river was important there. The Velur, thing is important. And of course, as far as the relation of Ellora to a religious site is, next to Ellora, in the sense, in the Ellora village itself, we have a temple which is known as Krishneshwar Mahadev temple, which is considered to be one of the Jyotirlingas. Jyotirlingas, as we know, that it is Swayambhu kind of thing, nobody installed it, and, so it is kind of comes naturally. So that means it's an ancient tradition there. Of course, the present day Krishneshwara temple has nothing to do with that historical thing, because it is built completely by the Marathas, or in the sense it is considered to be renovated by Ahalya Bai Holkar. So she has a sacred pond there, and there is a sacred temple there. So this is all related to this kind of sacredness of Ellora. So that's why they are kind of starting the activity from, say, Krishneshwar temple, or Krishneshwar and that river, which actually starts from, in the sense flows through Ellora. So, when you look at Ellora, once me and Professor Kannal, maybe a few years back, we had we were working on Ellora for some other project. So always Ellora is considered to be Rashtrakuta site. Everybody says Rashtrakuta site. So we were kind of, taking a note of who built what and what kind of time period. And we realized that there are very few activities of Rashtrakutas there, in the sense. You have the Brahminical caves, you have the Buddhist caves, you have the Jain caves. Of course, if you consider Jain caves, it becomes equal. But most of the activity prior to, say, cave number 15 at Ellora doesn't look like Rashtrakuta. In the sense, it is definitely can be dated to pre-Rashtrakuta phase. In the sense, maybe starting from, say, late 5th century, early 6th century, 7th century and early 8th century. So most of the activities, at Ellora, if you count, say, 33 caves are there, if you count 33, maybe 15 or 16, or that's built by, by the rulers before the Rashtrakutas. Then of course we have the Rashtrakuta activity at Ellora, and I also think that Ellora Kailashnath has played a role. That of course we'll discuss when we discuss the Kailash. But Ellora becomes a kind of important site for the reason that, as I said earlier, that you can also see this kind of transformation from the Buddhist tradition to the Brahminical tradition. Of course you can see that. The sense, but I belongs to a group, or belongs to a group of scholars who doesn't exactly kind of try to fit the architecture tradition with a religious tradition, because of course, I mean, when you look at the plan and everything, that's fine. I mean, each religion has its own plan, style. I mean, especially when you talk about early Buddhist activities, say Chaitya Grihas and things like that. But if you want to kind of distinguish between the Jain activity and the Brahminical activity, and especially in relation with architecture, it is slightly problematic. In the sense, the pillars will be the same as the Brahminical pillars and the Buddhist pillars and the Jain pillars may be the same. So maybe the superstructure may change, but we come to a kind of phase, especially after say 6th century, 7th century, all these buildings look the same. I would say, and one example which comes to my mind is if you look at say Brihadeshwara temple at Tanjavur, and you look at Bodh Gaya, the Mahabodhi temple at Bodh Gaya, they look the same from outside, but it is two different styles. Or when you look at say the Jain temples of Rajasthan and the Brahminical temples or the Hindu temples of Rajasthan, they look the same. So you cannot exactly, looking at architecture, you cannot exactly define, okay, this belongs to this religion and this belongs to that religion, because as it is coming from India itself, I mean, most of them kind of shared those things. So in post-Ajanta phase also, you see this kind of unification of all the religious traditions, if there was kind of difference. I mean, especially in the case of Buddhist architecture, we have to say. This kind of unified pattern of architecture you can see in Ellora. Like when you see the caves at Ellora, especially I'm talking about cave number 12, then 11, which is known as Dotal and Tintal. So one of them has, the Buddha figures are kept almost like a kind of Tirthangaras placed, and especially in cave number 11, if I remember correctly. And when you look from outside, they don't look, it can be a Jain temple also, it can be a Buddhist temple also, it can be a Brahminical temple also, as we see in the case of Dashavatara cave. So you have this Tintal, Dotal, Tintal, though it is the wrong name for those caves. Cave number 11 and 12, and then 15 you have the same pattern. So it becomes kind of a unified style. I mean, if like for example, you can see a lot of elements of Ajanta in the case of cave number 21, that is Rameshwara cave. And so you can see that especially the later caves of Ajanta, in the sense the Ashmakan caves of Ajanta, you have this kind of pattern, which is a small veranda, then you have a kind of circumambulatory path, then you have the Upavarnakas. This kind of pattern is actually repeated in cave number 21, I mean Rameshwara cave. Then you have new patterns are coming. I mean, in the sense it is again the phase, especially from 5th century to 9th century, it is a kind of a space for experimental cave architecture. And that's another reason Ellora becomes very, very interesting, that you have a experimentation. Everywhere this experimentation is happening. And another thing is that you can actually feel or see certain cases that you have say, okay, this craftsman is coming from Andhra Pradesh, this craftsman is coming from Karnataka, this craftsman is coming from Madhya Pradesh. Of course, I'm using the present day Indian states. I mean, that time of course it was known in different names. So you have this different craftsmen, and whenever we talk about architecture or sculpture, many times we don't exactly realize, or we doesn't exactly acknowledge this movement of the craftsman, which is very interesting, that why the craftsman is moving. Nobody is asking the question that why the craftsman is moving. Of course, the craftsmen, especially the say stone cutters and people like that, we have evidences that they are migrated from one place to the other, and definitely they are looking for a job. I mean, so the craftsmen kind of carries the tradition. They come to say Ajanta. They are looking at what others are doing, so they kind of acquire that particular knowledge. And then when they travel to somewhere else, say for example Ajanta, we have a kind of the track of the craftsman. You can say that okay, they are going to the sites in Vijayawada, that Vishnugundan sites. Then from there they are going towards, say, the tradition is traveling. Instead of just seeing the style as the behest of the or bequeathed by the rulers, rather it is better to look at the style as carried by the craftsman. Because the craftsman doesn't, whatever, they have one way of doing. In the sense, so if you want that kind of pillar, you call that craftsman. No, that kind of, activities, that kind of approach was there. And again, the two people who are, the stakeholders in this thing is the patrons and the craftsman. The patron has all the right to call any kind of craftsman. Doesn't matter whether they are the local craftsmen or whatever. Like for example, in the case of Ellora Kailashnath, we know that the craftsman definitely came from Mahabalipuram. In the sculpture you can actually see that there is a South Indian or the Mahabalipuram tradition or the Pallava tradition is coming. And there are some sculptures when you look at Ellora Kailashnath, especially Ellora Kailashnath, you can say that okay, this sculptor is from, say, Pattadakal. This sculptor is from, say, Mahabalipuram. Because the way they do it, in the sense, there is one sculpture, I remember that this is the abduction of Sita Haran and Jatayuvatha, which is a kind of ditto copy or ditto of the work which you see in Pattadakal. That's on one side of Ellora Kailashnath. On the other side you have, say, Mahishasuramadhini, which is very, very, very close to, not exactly a ditto copy, but very, very close to the Pallava tradition. So, I don't want to say that, I don't want to agree to the, sometimes people say that, oh, only the sculptor came. No, the sculptor, there is no kind of, what we can say, distinction between the sculptor and the architect. The architect is also coming. So you have this kind of traveling of the styles, different styles, and whenever there is an activity happening, people will come and say the craftsman will come and work there, and then they go from there. They may go back home, and some craftsmen may not come back. They will go somewhere else. Recently I was watching some documentary which is Ancient Aliens or something like that, and they are saying, oh, Ellora is so precision carving that cannot be humanly possible for possible at that particular time. And they also said that, the people who does not have understanding of mathematics and engineering cannot build it. Unfortunately, when you look at Ellora, we are very sure that who carved it. There is no problem of who is. There is no mystery about Ellora Kailashnath, who carved it, and the precision of mathematics, all those things. That is, Indian architecture has achieved it much better or much before than Ellora. But what you see in Ellora is that you have two traditions, because when you look at Indian cave architecture tradition, there are two approaches. One is known as the crust carving. Crust carving, in the sense, you have carving which is, you have a kind of rock, and then you kind of change the rock from the external carving. It is carved from the outside. Mahabalipuram is a good example of that. Or before Mahabalipuram, of course I should not say that it is started from Mahabalipuram. You have, in the case of Khandagiri, Udayagiri caves in Orissa, which is using this kind of external carving, which is, I also call it as the Eastern tradition, which is usually you have in Eastern side, that is, Khandagiri, Udayagiri in Orissa, then you have in Mahabalipuram, for the reason that it is difficult to carve. Especially the eastern side of India, you have slightly what we can say harder rock, especially in the case of Mahabalipuram, you know that it is granite. It is not easy to carve, and as you do in the case of Western India. Western India on the other side, it is more suitable for what we call as the core carving. Core carving in the sense you kind of go inside and carve, or as somebody says that inside out carving or outside inside carving. It is not exactly right terminology, I would say, but it's core carving that you go inside and then you build it. Now that is suitable in the case of Western India for the reason that the Western India the rock is softer, and Western India, because of the rain and all those things, the exterior rock is always problematic. So in the case of, say, to give an example, you have, say, Karla, Bhaja, the Western Indian caves, the Hinayana Western Indian caves are all carved like, using the core carving. But on the other side, you have, on the eastern side, you have carvings which is basically external carvings. Which is suitable for monoliths and like that. But in the case of Ellora, you see, except, say, Kailasha temple and cave number 15, that is Dashavatara, Nandi Mandapa, rest of them are all carved, using the core carving technique. Of course, the Dashavatara cave is, core carving as well as the, crest carving. And of course, you in the case of say Jain temples, you also see the core carving and the external carving, in the sense crest carving. There is a monolith which is created there. Of course, that is a later tradition. But in the case of, say, most of the Western Indian caves like Ajanta, they never try to approach monolithic kind of structure, and that is probably the reason that the Rashtrakutas prefer to do this monolith carving in Kailashnath. And then when you look at that, I was talking about the craftsman also, that if you want to become, you kind of want to create a architecture which is monolith, where do you get the craftsman, who has an experience of creating monolith? Because monolith, carving is very, very different kind of approach. You have to kind of measure it right in the beginning. You have to have proper planning to do a monolith carving. You have to have a whole idea about what you are going to make. It's very close, of course. Later in 9th century, 10th century, there is a aesthetician from Kashmir who says that, of course, said much before Michelangelo, where this particular thing is usually everybody identifies this as Michelangelo. But he says that when you look at a rock, you see the elephant inside. And you remove the rock which is not elephant. Michelangelo said the same thing, of course, without knowing this, poor guy. So I am not saying that he picked up from us or something like that. But the Kshemendra, the aesthetician, actually says that this is what we can say deductive carving. That you see something. So in the case of Mahabalipuram, you can actually see that this is what they did. Like, for example, some building must be, or some rock must be looking like Arjuna Ratha or Draupadi Ratha. So they removed the rock which is not Draupadi Ratha. So they are already conceiving it. But in the case of internal carving or the core carving, you have a flat thing, and you kind of go inside. Then you kind of create different areas and the spaces and all those things. One is based on space, other is based on form, how the form is going to build up. And of course, the Ellora Kailashnath, they had to go for the core, because the core, in the sense that especially in Western India, unlike say Eastern India, that is Mahabalipuram and all, as I said, the rock surface outside is, because of the incessant rains and and of course the structure of the rock itself, that you have a lot of vesicles in the rock. So through that the water kind of passes through. So you have to remove and come to a core of the rock. And that's why in Ellora Kailashnath you have, they have removed around 80, feet of rock to come to the level. But usually the myth is that, some king was falling sick or something like that, and then his wife said, I will build a temple for Shiva, whatever, if he is cured of that. Then what happens is that he gets cured. Then she says, fine, I won't eat food till I, see the kalash of the temple. It's a myth, of course. So the kalash of the temple. So then they've got completely, confused. How do you build a temple? Because building a temple and coming to the kalash, she may die. So you start with the kalash. What do you do? It is a reverse kind of thing. So you start with the kalash and you start, so show her that kalash is done. You eat food, something like that. This is a myth, of course. To removing 80 feet of rock, she must have died already. So the thing is that you start with the top and then you come down. And of course, in the case of Kailash Nath, you have certain alterations which is done in this kind of plan, which is very interesting. But you have to remove this much rock, because when you look at the portion behind Ellora Kailash Nath, you have a huge rock surface which is kind of cleaned up. We can actually see that. Because they were looking for the right rock, or the right quality of the rock. The quality of the rock is very important for architecture, in the sense, when you're talking about architecture, durability is a must in architecture. You cannot exactly have indurable structures, for especially a project like Ellora. So you have to have that kind of strength of the rock. So they kind of removed 80 feet of rock. Now, the other thing is that when you look at, say, cave number 15, that is the Shavatara. Now, you have the Shavatara, there is a Mantapa which has an inscription of Dante Durga. You can actually see that they were playing with this, Rashtrakutas, especially when you look at Rashtrakuta architecture, we always say that it is Rashtrakutas does this shuffling of the architecture tradition. That if all the architectures are, A type, they will start with X type. They will just insert an X type there. So a person who is looking at all the A types, all of a sudden comes to X type and said, oh, this is a different kind of temple. What happened? So the difference is something which they play with. Like for example, when they make in Ellora, all the caves are, what we can say, core carving, and then all of a sudden you have this, monolith. So that's kind of a surprise there. And in the case of, say, they do the same thing in Pattadakal, that all the temples are built in the so-called Dravida style. And then comes a temple which is, Kashi Vishweshwara. All of a sudden you see that, oh, it is done differently. So this is somebody else must have done. So this kind of distinction of architecture you can see in the case of Ellora. There are two types of carving when you get in cave architecture in India. One is the kind of tunnel style. Tunnel style is that you carve, a tunnel, and then you leave the rock. What you get in Ajanta, especially in cave number 24 at Ajanta, you can actually see this process. So you have a tunnel, you create a tunnel, and you get another tunnel. And then in between you have this kind of thin rock. And so if somebody is carving this tunnel, two people, maybe two people can stand there and carve. Only two people. And this tunnel also two people can stand. And the splinters of this surface or this rock won't go into the other. Then you kind of knock down this, in between thin layers of rock. That's the style which is done in Ajanta. And probably that is also the style done in the case of, say, earlier caves, like Hinayana caves. I don't want to say this about the case of Udayagiri cave in Malwa. The other style is blocking style. Blocking style is you make the block and you cut the blocks around, then you chop it. What Mahabalipuram artists will do. Like Mahabalipuram, you can actually see the mesh style of carving. Mesh style in the sense, you create a kind of mesh and you carve that borders of that mesh, then you create a block and you knock off that block. That's how it is done. Now in the case of Ellora Kailash Nath, you can actually see this mesh type which is on the floor. So the people who are used to, say, granite carving, usually people say that, oh, this is not possible in humanly impossible and all those things because it is so heavy rock to remove, and it will take some time. Yes, it will take some time, no doubt. But the person who has worked in granite, if he works in, say, in a softer stone like, say, Ellora, it is very easy for them to remove it very fast. And of course, this is not done by artists, it is done by technicians. As we jokingly say that the engineer of Ellora Kailashnath was a Pallava person, and the architect was a Chalukyan person. So you have this technique which is used in Ellora, which is much faster. And you can actually remove in day or two you can actually remove a huge block, and these blocks are not exactly carried out, it is rolled down. So it is easier for them to roll down the stones. Rather than carrying it will take some time. The rolls are rolling style is something which is probably they did. So my point here is that you have, when you look at the style itself, you can actually see the Pallava carvers, that is, so-called quote unquote, South Indian. Then you have a Deccan tradition, that is the Chalukyan tradition. Then you have the Western Indian tradition, that is the earlier cave, artists. And of course, this cave artisans, or in the sense cave architects, that tradition must have been stayed in Western India. So, when you look at the caves like Ajanta 10, which is a huge cave, as far as space is concerned, or Karla, it's a huge cave. So, if they can do it in, say, 1st century AD and 1st century BC, it's, in the case of Ellora, it's much later. And as I said, I want to kind of re-emphasize that the stone quality at Ellora is much better, and it is much softer. Because the Deccan trap, they are working with the Deccan trap, and they are used to the Deccan trap. And the craftsmen who are coming from, say, when I say this difference is that if you, there is a way of even holding a chisel. A person who is working with if you have noticed that if you go to Mahabalipuram, a person working with the chisel will, hold the chisel like that, and then they kind of bang it. But in the case of, say, a craftsman who is doing marble carving in, say, Rajasthan, he will be holding the chisel like this. So the softer the thing is. So if you are using that kind of thing, holding the chisel and banging it in Rajasthan, you will break the stone. So, the chisel and the chisel tradition, or the way the tools are used in Ellora, definitely is a great, it is what we can say, it's an advanced stage as Ajanta, compared to Ajanta. But the craftsman has acquired that particular tradition. And I have a feel, that's what I'm saying, that, there is a kind of amalgamation of Western Indian as well as, Eastern Indian tradition over here in Ellora. The Kailash temple at Ellora becomes one of the, greatest monument which is built in India. There's no doubt about it. Though it may not come into the 7 wonders of the world, but it is definitely one of the greatest monuments which is built. For the reason that, the activity which is started probably around 750, conceived by, again, probably Danta Durga. Of course, Danta Durga dies by 756 or 57, he dies. But that activity must have started or initiated by him. And what you get in the case of Ellora Kailashnath is a national style of architecture. That why I'm saying it is national style, it is because it encompasses most of the art activity of India happened before. You see Ajanta there, you see Badami there, you see Mahabalipuram there, or all the activities of this area there. And we know that definitely the artisans of Western India, of Badami, or in the sense Chalukyan region, of Mahabalipuram region has definitely worked over there. And we know the person, in the sense Danta Durga and Krishna was in friendly terms with Pallavas. They even had marital alliance with the Pallavas because they were the enemies of Chalukyans and the Chalukyans were enemies of Pallavas. So the Pallavas become the the enemy's enemy is our friend, that kind of thing. And there are references of Dandadurga's daughter Reva getting married to Pallava Malla, and one of them, the son, from that relation is known as Dandivarman, basically taking from his grandfather's name. So you have so when a king is kind of getting into, a marital alliance, you can actually say that, even the craftsman travels along the dowry sometimes. Like for example, when we look at the Vakatakas and their marital alliance with, because Prabhavati Gupta, the daughter of Vikramaditya, the Gupta king, was married to somebody in the Vakataka court, or somebody Vakataka king. And probably along with her comes, a group of craftsmen also, because, the package will be there, the dowry package also includes craftsmen and all those things. So there is a kind of relation. And as far as the Chalukyan area, craftsmen is concerned, that now they realize that now there is not much of activity going to happen here. And, when the activities are happening in Chalukyan, that time during the war or prior to the war, you have, say, the greatest building, Virupaksha temple and Mallikarjuna being built. So they are also coming. Now, when you look at, say, Ellora from outside, it gives a lot of Mahabalipuram element because it is monolith. But when you go closer to Ellora, looking at the detail of the pillars and all those things, it has a lot of closeness to Virupaksha temple. Now, these three temples, I consider them as the victory temples, like Kailashnath at Kanchipuram, Virupaksha temple at Patadakal, and Kailashnath temple at Ellora. These are the kind of victory monuments, because that is coming from some kind of great victory they had. It is a commemoration monuments, because Rajasimha kind of defeated, all around, and he builds this kind of victory temple. That is, Kailashnath temple at Kanchipuram. And then you have Vikramaditya, probably, attacking Vikramaditya II, probably attacking Kanchipuram as a revenge that, you defeated us and we defeat you. So you have an inscription of Vikramaditya II at Kanchipuram temple, because the inscription says that, the soldiers started demolishing Kanchipuram temple. Then comes the emperor. Emperor comes to the scene and he looks at the temple and he makes a statement that I like the temple. I really love the temple. So what he says that don't break it. So he makes some, repairs to whatever area is broken and all those things. Of course, he inscribes it in the pillar saying that I spared this temple. Okay? And then he comes back and he makes this temple, Virupaksha temple at Patadakal, and he says that I built this temple because, for the reason that we had this kind of great victory over the Kanchipuram. And probably, there is this full confusion that, whether there are two craftsmen working in, or two stapatis working in Virupaksha temple. And the inscription says that Tengana Deshanam, one of the craftsmen is from Tengana Desha. If you read it as Tengana Desha, the craftsman is coming from south. You can also read it Tengana Dishana, that means the southern side of the temple is given to that particular craftsman. But we can see a lot of closeness between Kanchipuram Kailashnath and Virupaksha temple. Like for example, the niches are made in this pattern which is known as three-tier pattern, three-tier or three-tier pattern thing. Where you have on top you have one small sculpture, then Makara Torana, whatever. Then you have a major sculpture. Then you have the lower portion again will have a smaller sculpture. This pattern you can see in Kailashnath's wall and you can see in Virupaksha wall. and also see it in Ellora Kailashnath. So you can actually see that it is one, this kind of indirect influence of Pallavas, and you have the Pallava architect, the engineer who is working there. Now, what is so interesting about Kailashnath is that you have this rock which is removed. As I said, there are huge amount of rock removed. It's actually probably more than the temple rock. They took it out. And for the reason that in Mahabalipuram the pattern of the rocks is different. Like you have on the seashore you have a kind of just a crop, and so you can kind of clean it up. But in the case of Ellora, it is a flat rock, so you have to clean it up in as you see in the case of in the style of removing the rock, like in the core style of carving. So they remove the rock. And now when they remove the rock, if you look at it, there is this canopy of rock which is coming out like that. The colonnade around, and there is a canopy of rock. And if you calculate that canopy and it comes down, it will actually touch the base. So what they did is that all of a sudden they come to I think what makes say Ellora Kailashnath different from Virupaksha temple. Monumentality definitely, and the lower portion of the Ellora Kailashnath, it's very interesting. It's a block. It is not exactly, you cannot go inside. It is, you actually go into the first floor, and the lower portion is a block. Now, why? If they made only that first floor, the temple would not have been as exciting as it is today. So what they did is that when they come to that thing, if you calculate the eave projecting out, or the rock surface projecting out, if you make up this thing, there will be small passage which is left out. But you have to have a space around. So what they do is that they cut the rock from keeping that rock, and they start cutting the rock from here and create the space around. And then the block is created, and how do you go about it? Either you can have a two-story structure, like in the case of say Brihadeshwara temple, it is a 2-3 story structure, whatever. You can have a 3-storied, wall, bhitti, which is not the style at that time. We always go for the one wall, that is the style, of course. Later they would have done something like that. But then they thought what to do. Then the architect, this is something which is only happens in Ellora. Only happens in Ellora. It is uniqueness of Ellora. Then the architect comes and says, fine, I will create this huge space. So what he does is that, usually in a temple, you have a, which is known as Gajadhara around it, around underneath the Kumuda or above the Kumuda, you can have this kind of Gajadhara, which is very small in a temple. He says, fine, we are not changing the iconographical details of the temple. We are not deviating from the text. Only thing is that I am increasing the size of the elephants. So instead of small elephant, miniature elephant, they are making huge elephant. The size goes off like, magnificent. So, you can see this kind of, in architecture you have this problem solving of architecture. You can see in the case of Ellora. And they had to do this kind of expansion, huge expansion they have to do. Probably they never thought about it, but you have to come with a new thing. So, in the case of say, even the plan wise, if you look at the plan of Ellora, you have a plan which is 3 mandapa. It's a cruciform kind of plan. I am saying cruciform kind, this is not exactly cruciform style. But you have one mandapa, another mandapa, third mandapa, and then the shrine. Now this kind of cruciform pattern, it is typical Karnataka. So the cruciform plan is that you have, in typical Karnataka plan, which of course later also used by the Karnataka artists. For example, if you look at the Hoysala structures, you have one mandapa, 3 shrines. So that's also a cruciform kind of thing. In later Chalukyan, Hoysala, you can see that. So in Ellora, you have, when you enter, you are entering through a main mandapa, which is from the Nandi Mandapa side. You enter the Mandapa, then you come to a Navaranka Mandapa, that's the Bhuta Mandapa kind of thing, where you have the bunch of 4 pillars, 4 pillars, 4 pillars, 4 pillars like that. So there are 16 pillars which is kind of bunched, not exactly like in the case of, you have to have the weight bearing and all those things. They understand the weight bearing issue now. So you have again 2 mandapas on both the side, lateral mandapas are there. Then you have the main shrine, then you have the circumambulatory path. Now this pattern is typical Chalukyan pattern. You don't see it in Mahabalipuram or in Pallava, any Pallava structures at all. So you can actually see that the whole space is conceived by a Chalukyan architect. Then comes this whole thing of, how do you carve it? Then because the Chalukyans are not exactly greatest carvers. The thing is that Chalukyans are actually gone away from this rock cut architecture, soon after the Pulikeshi comes to power. So they kind of shift to structural temples. In the case of say Pallavas, they kind of sustain that even slightly later. But I think in both the cases, after a particular period, you don't exactly see cave architecture. Say, for example, in Mahabalipuram, after Mamalla, you don't see much of cave architecture. They are all shifting to structural temples, For the reason that it's very interesting that, usually in cave architecture, it is, earlier phases, they are looking at the structural architecture, then they are copying that in the cave architecture. What do you see in case of Hinayana caves? Like, you can see a lot of detailing of wooden architecture and all those things, palace architecture. You can see in the case of Hinayana. But then it becomes so that, they are working on that, cave architecture only. Then there is a shift that, from the experience acquired through cave architecture, they started building structural architecture. That is the case of Chalukyans. In the case of Pallavas, you have that. And now in the case of Ellora Kailasanath, those structural architecture elements are coming back to cave architecture. When you enter into the temple itself, you have on left side there is Agastya. Again, the iconographical connection of South India that is there. Then you have Mahishasura which looks like a Chalukyan Mahishasura. Then you come to a Gajalakshmi, looks like a Western Indian Gajalakshmi. Then you go on left side, you have some sculptures which looks like Chalukyan sculptures. Then next to that there is a Pallava sculpture, like that. So when you, it's a great experience that, when you look at the monumentality, in the photograph you will never get that monumentality of Ellora. For the reason that 2 pillars actually create that, breaks it. But when you realize the height of the pillars, you actually realize the monumentality of it. It's a huge, humongous activity. But the thing is that why it is so huge? For the reason that when you are carving this much, now they realize that if you leave certain things, it is lesser carving, the faster the work is. More carving, more work is. So, but the thing is that when you look at that structure, the main structure, you can see a lot of early Rashtrakuta, and you don't have to go anywhere. You just look from the left side. When you look on the on your left, you can see the Lankeshwara cave. You can see this, and Lankeshwara cave and the Paralanka was actually linked by what we can say. The bridges, but those are that time I'm sure not exactly devised as a cave itself, but they were kind of viewing galleries of the temple. And so when you look at say Nandi Mandapa has a lot of pilasters, which is detached pilasters. Let's say usually it is when you say detached pillars, it becomes a columns on the sides. So you have this kind of undercuts which is used a lot in the case of Nandi Mandapa. So Nandi Mandapa exterior is done slightly later, no doubt about it. So the question is that can you do a temple without consecrating a temple without finishing that? I have a feeling that yes, the temple is finished, so they must have consecrated. They must have certain areas left out. Then you have the Nandi Mandapas and all those things. So it is very difficult to kind of place where and all those things. But I mean, when you look at Kailashnath, I mean, the plan of Kailashnath and even the elevation of Kailashnath has actually gone beyond. In the sense, when you look at the later activity of whether it is the Nayakas or if it is even Pandyas. Like there is one temple in very close to Madurai. It is known as Kalugumalai. Kalugumalai temple is a ditto copy of, say, Ellora Kailashnath. So everybody want to make this kind of magnificent structure, which is like that. Even the later Rashtrakutas tried that. Like in Maharashtra, I mean in Madhya Pradesh, you have a site which is known as Vasali, which is a Rashtrakuta site, very close to what we can say Ellora. They tried to carve, I mean in the sense the beginning carving, but they never finished that. Then you have say Dhamnar, the famous Dhamnar, where it is a Dharmadada temple at Dhamnar, which is near Mandsaur, where you have this monolith structure, but not in the South Indian style or the so-called Dravidian style. You have a Nagara style of thing. So the influence of Ellora goes beyond its kind of range. And what is more important is that when you look at, even if you consider a lot of medieval elements are coming there, over decoration and what we can say grandeur, which is the kind of watchword, grandeur and complexity, which is very Baroque-ish kind of quality, which is there. That actually starts from Ellora Kailashnath itself. Like for example, the pillars and Nandi Mandapa especially, the kind of beginning of this kind of what we can say grandeur and complexity, which becomes the watchword for most of the dynasties who comes later. The key factor for architecture is that the architect will be looking at how it is used, that they have to. Like for example, even the relation between the different people coming in. Like for example, in the case of say Kerala architecture, that you have this kind of layers of walls and this thing. I mean doors. So in earlier times, each door was actually a deterrent for a certain group of people or a certain caste should not come inside that. So you have this kind of, architecture is designed based on the social function of it or who uses it. Like for example, in the case of say in Chola temples and in the Vijayanagara temples, you have a entry. Direct entry is not exactly given for everybody. So you are supposed to have the side entries, because the ceremonial entry, the straight entry, is only given to the emperor. The emperor can only enter from that, and the rest of the people will be entering from sides. In the case, or other example is that when you have the circumambulation and a congregation, so you put that square congregational space and circular around the stupa, you get a apsidal shrine, which is very much like a Chaitanya. But in the case of Ellora, they have this, there is no separate entries or anything like that. I think it was much more everybody can enter or nobody can enter, that kind of thing. So there is only single entry or, the small entry, and then you kind of have a circumambulatory path, around the shrine itself. Then you have another circumambulatory around the thing. So, I have to say, I don't think we have to go too much into this, function of architecture. Apart from the function of architecture, especially religious structures, will be determined by the use of, or the rituals related to that. That's in the case of say church architecture, you have a congregation is there. But in the case of Brahminical architecture or Hindu architecture, you don't need to have that congregation. And if you ask me, later you have this public congregation much more. in the case of say medieval temples. Okay. So you have this congregational element which is not there in Ellora, because in the mandapa it is not a congregatory space in Ellora. So later in medieval period you have this more open congregatory spaces. In the case of Ellora it is basically just one entry, and you come to the mandapa, then you go to the shrine, and the shrine, the antechamber is also not equipped to have more than say 25 people there. It becomes slightly crowded if you take 25 people. So the entry level is, or in the sense the function of it, the circumambulatory, that is a key element over there. The circumambulatory, because you have two doors flanking the main shrine, so you take a circumambulation around, which is not in the sense in Virupaksha temple, where the plan is basically coming from there. You have a circumambulatory path which is already defined, and the temple wall is kind of encompassed there. And another very important aspect of Ellora, or interesting aspect of Ellora, is that when you take the circumambulation, you have the sub-shrines. There are 3 sub-shrines very close to Kanchipuram Kailashnath. Though in Kanchipuram Kailashnath you go to the sub-shrines from outside, but in Ellora Kailashnath you cannot exactly fly, so you will take it from inside the veranda, the circumambulatory path. It's kind of open circumambulatory path. It goes like that. It serves 2 purposes. One is a ritualistic purpose. The second thing is, when you have a building and you have an extended, what we can say, circumambulatory path, or a huge circumambulatory path, the size increases, so the monumentality increases. But when you are seeing from the lower portion, if you look at it, it almost looks like there is nothing in between. It is a kind of a huge shikhara which is there, but in between there is this path. And when you have in this kind of circumambulatory path, in the sense this kind of sub-shrines, so one will be given to Ganapati or Devi or Saptamatrakas. The longer one is probably Saptamatrakas. So they do this ritual and come back. But as far as Ellora Kailashnath is concerned, I don't think it was used that much. For the reason that there's not much of soot deposit we can see in Ellora Kailashnath, not much. They must have been used for some time, because when the people are going and when you are making other things next to it, some kind of extended sub-shrines, that means it has been used, but not much. When I say much I'm talking about maybe 100 years or something like that. And even the soot deposit which you see in Ellora Kailashnath, doesn't mean that it has been used. That's the soot deposit, because it has been used by, say, Gyaneshwar. Son Gyaneshwar actually lived in Ellora Kailashnath or Ellora. So a lot of people kind of misused also, from 13th century onwards, because what you get from the references on Ellora, interesting, the first one to note on Ellora, of course, Gyaneshwar is there. After Gyaneshwar is the daughter of Aurangzeb, who came and wrote about Ellora, that okay, this is a great monument and all those things. Then you have a French traveller who came and looked at Ellora. So it was kind of abandoned. We know that around 14th century, or when Daulatabad or the Yadavas were there, I don't think Yadavas took keen interest in Ellora, because they must have, if they had taken interest in Ellora, it would have been different. Okay, so there is misuse also. There is a possibility that it's used in a different manner. Another thing which is we have to talk about is the relation with this river. The river, there is a lot of this, waterfalls, and there must have been nalas. So it was a kind of, now of course the problem with Ellora is that what we have now is completely, you get a complete different picture of Ellora because of the renovations and adding things which is done by archaeology department where you can actually see from cave number 6 there is a waterfall, and this waterfall is supposed to join with this main waterfall. So you have cave number 6 had a waterfall, of course there is a, you can see in monsoon you can actually see that. Then cave number between cave number 16 and 17 there was another waterfall. Then of course cave number 22, after 22 there is a kind of waterfallish thing, of course now it is not there. Then the between cave number 27 and 29, which we said Sita Canal. So there are all these waterfalls. All this will come into a river or river kind of riverine thing. So what we see now Kailashnath is not the level which people saw it earlier. That we have to keep in mind, because the entry to Ellora is now almost on the ground level. You walk slightly up and then you come to Ellora, Kailashnath. But that was not the entry, in the sense, earlier people saw it as a riverlet, and on the other side of the riverlet you see that. So the elevation, what we see now is, we are actually around 15 feet or 20 feet above the real elevation, real visual thing of Ellora, and that would have been very different.